Good evening. Good evening welcome to the Lake Norman Church of Christ. Welcome to all those in person and those connecting with us online. We're this evening in our second in a series of lessons on how to study the Bible, presented by Howard Younger. Howard has a long history of studying history and studying the Bible, a long history of preaching God's Word in various congregations in multiple corners of the world. Also has a background in business management and has been here with Lake Norman congregation for a number of years. So Mr. Younger gave us a lesson last week and we'll continue the series this evening. We're looking forward to the lesson, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Howard.
Thank you, John. Again, I appreciate the opportunity from the leadership of this congregation to present the lectures on how to study the Bible. I had received a number of questions over the last week. I'm going to try to address those as I walk my way through the second lecture. But if you have questions, any of you, and those of you that are here, I would want you to very much to ask those questions, send them to our website, send them to my email address if you have that, and we'll try to address them in either before the next lecture or during the next lecture. So let's get further into this. I'm going to touch on translations in this lecture, and I'll get through those slides in a moment. I had said some things last week regarding translations, and I suggested that when you're studying the text, the Bible, that it's very almost a mandate to effectively study out of a couple of different translations. That almost all of our major translations, and if you got questions, come back at me which one you might have. We've got a list of the translations on a separate sheet that's available to you from the website, the church website, as well as a vocabulary, if you will, list in terms that I might use without explaining them. So I try not to do that, but if I do use some word that you haven't heard before, don't feel as though somehow you should have known it. It's just something that I might have run into, and it'd be like John teaching something on whatever he teaches on, that I wouldn't have any vocabulary whatsoever, some science verbiage. So please just ask, come back at me. Your questions are very relevant. I guess we ought to begin a little bit in terms of a couple of scriptures that comes to my mind. In Romans 13:14, the New King James Version has this text. If you want to take the time to look that up, I'm going to read it anyway, but it's Romans 13:14. And Paul uses the word flesh in a number of places. And I don't want to say never, but I'm thinking right now if there's a place that he might have used it when he's talking about the body. Most of the time, especially when I was younger and studying, I looked at it and thought flesh was the body. That would not be an unnatural response. That is and it comes a great deal from some of our translations. They don't bother to explain it. For example, the New King James Version, make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust. And the NIV does something a little bit different. It goes on to explain that. I'm not sure what other versions you might have that's out there. I've got a whole bunch of them up here this evening. If I need them, I'll pull them out. But it is a word that Paul utilizes to reflect that which is not positive within our humanity. That is, what Paul is really saying here in that particular verse, do not look and utilize yourselves as you have been, as you might have done in the past. He's not talking about flesh as we know it. He's not talking about sexual immorality or any of those things. That's applicable perhaps, but that's not what he's referring to here. We need to know Jesus, if you will, in terms of being a new creation. And that's what he's referring to here. But again, if you look at some of our translations, it's hard to get that out of there. John, which one do you have?
New King James.
Okay, well then you have, and Shirley, you have the same. All right, and that follows the King James Version, the New American Standard Version. They follow the sequence of King James, basically, version. And as I told you before, or as I said last week, the King James Version is one of the most utilized texts that there exists in English. But unfortunately, it was written in 1611, and it utilized manuscripts that they had at the time, and not a lot of them. They took a lot of that from the Vulgate translation that was produced around 400 AD. So it isn't anything wrong with the King James Version whatsoever. It is that they're utilizing documents, if you will, that were older, harder to look at, and they translated them into English in 1611. I would imagine most people, if you pick up a text and written in 1611, it's extraordinarily difficult to read. Well, the objective behind the translations, particularly the English translations, is to get across to the audience that which was written to the audience in the first century. To do that takes a great deal of work and etc. So we need to make a real effort when we're studying to look at the text that's there. And I said over and over last week, I'll keep saying it over and over, there is nothing more important when you're studying the Bible than looking at the context. And I'm going to make some points about the context. Literally, that is, we're looking at passages that would include those around the passage that we dig into. Okay. I think I need to follow my lesson things here a little bit. We have become a Google church, a Google group of people. I was talking to my granddaughter this evening on a particular item, had to do with history. Well, I'll just look it up. And I said, but you don't know all the details. You need to look at the history text that you're utilizing. We were talking about medieval history, etc. Well, obviously, I'm a little more concentrated on that than what she wanted to be. But the point is still the same. The first thing we do is reach out there and grab the internet. In terms of translations, the difficulty with that kind of a concept is that the translations come to us usually put together by committees and groups of professors that are very well knowledge in terms of both Greek and Hebrew. Groups of them. They get together and intermingle, discuss every passage before they go about trying to translate it. You don't get that on the internet. You get somebody's opinion that's got the name listed there, but that's all you have. It's all right to give you a thought process. If you're looking, if you're away from the building right now and it's a student that I'm talking to, but don't rely on the internet for your studying habits. And The other thing that I need to emphasize over and over again as we begin to study the text more effectively, it's not about me. Now, someone says, well, I want answers, Howard. I want answers in life or whatever. They're in there. But it isn't about you. It's about God in terms of how He has presented His Word to humanity. And the text that are in there makes answers. It says, I want you to go about your life like this. And in a sense, I guess that's about me, but it isn't pulling out specific answers to specific kinds of questions. It is a story about God. Now, and I had invited those that have an atheistic point of view or agnostic point of view and suggested this would be just as well. If you don't believe in God, I understand that. I'd be happy to discuss it, but I understand it. It is whoever's writing it in the Bible, though, believed in God. So therefore, this is their thought process in terms of how they went about their belief. So if you're studying the Bible from an agnostic point of view, that is, I don't really believe in God, but I'm reading a text that's done hundreds and hundreds of millions of publications, and you say, well, this is important, therefore I need to read it. That's true. But the person writing that, in terms of whatever period of time, whatever text that you put into that, is writing it from a perspective that they believed in God and they're carrying their story for it. So the story in the Bible is one pervasive one about God from the author's point of view. And whether you believe in God or not, it is still their perspective of what the Bible is saying. So in order to get that perspective, it's like reading Shakespeare. If you want to understand Shakespeare, you can't just read the story there. You've got to understand why he wrote it, what the background is in the story, the historical concepts around it, etc., etc. That's how we should be reading the Bible. And so, therefore, it's not a resource manual in which, well, if I do this, and this, and something else, I'll understand it. That's not what it is. It is God-centered from the author's point of view to an audience that is God-centered and therefore has some relevance to what they were trying to do. And I'll repeat myself a bit. It can never be greater, the message can never be more than what it meant to the audience in which it was written. You say, well, Howard, I study it and I get revelation, and I'm not going to negate that. But understand, first of all, what the author's intent was, what the text says around itself, and who the audience was, and what message they got out of it. And that is the message that you can understand. In other words, you can't just pick out a particular passage of Scripture and look at it and say, okay, that's got to mean that, or this has got to mean that because it means something to me that way. No. Understand what the author was trying to write, realize what the text is saying, and at that point, what an audience he expected to have and what kind of answer he expected. Now, next week, I'm going to try to talk about parables. John's been teaching parables here on Sunday morning. And we classify a lot of things as parables that aren't. I'm going to take just a second to touch on that. This is from, and you'll pick up on what it's for, and those of you who's not quite familiar with it, you'll find it in Luke 10. This comes from one of the most esteemed theologians in our history, 400 AD. And man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. That means it was Adam. This is his interpretation. Jerusalem, the heavenly city of peace from which Adam fell. Jericho is the moon, and thereby signifies Adam's immortality. Robbers are the devil and his angels. Stripped him of his immortality, beat him, persuading him to sin, leaving him half dead. As a man he lives, but he died spiritually. Therefore he's half dead. The priests and Levites, the priesthood and ministry of the Old Testament. The Samaritan is, now you know who I'm talking about, this is said to mean the guardian, therefore Christ himself. bandaged his wounds, and I'll go on and on. Augustine wrote that. And I got a response from Dr. Richard there. Yeah, a fantastic theologian. What was the problem? Because he looked at the parable and said, okay, I've got to identify each piece of that, and he completely missed the point. Because what's that particular parable about? Who is my neighbor? That's really, what relationship do I have with that person? Because that was asked of Jesus, and he answers it with this parable. Parables, and John, you can, whatever you want to do to teach, but parables are not written so that they're not understood. And we'll talk about that. There's a quote from Jesus, and people think that falls. But the parables are a story, start and to finish. They send a message, and they expect a response from the audience. If you don't get that, that's sort of like doing a joke. I tell you a joke, and you say, well, I don't get that, Howard. So you go through and you start analyzing, and pretty soon it's not funny. It didn't bring out the response that the author, or in my case, if I gave you a joke, probably wouldn't be very good anyway. But it didn't bring out the response I'm anticipating. So therefore, it's imperative that we go about understanding what the author has to say, to what the text says, and to the audience in which they responded. Then and only then can we understand it. That is, then and there, here and now. We do need to be making application. Otherwise, the text has no meaning. If all it was done was written in the 1st century or 1,500 years before that, it would have no meaning. Then and there, understand what it was to the audience, what the author was trying to do, and the text in which it was written, and figure out the application, if you will, after you've done that. If you do it before, you end up having an interpretation on every parts of the Bible, and it can mean anything to anyone. The Bible is not written that way. Even if you don't believe in God and whatever, it's still not written that way. That makes sense? Makes sense, huh? There's my favorite cartoon picture. I'm looking for a specific item, if you will, to justify my preconceived notions. If we take the text and start to do that, then we've done exactly what that little cartoon is. Don't bother me. I've got preconceived notions, and I'm trying to find a text to justify it. You can do that with the Bible, but it's not what it was meant when it was written. And that's the problem that we get into. Again, then and there, here and now. It can never mean more to us than to their original audience. In order for us to make an application, we must understand what the author had in mind, what the audience was receiving, and what the text has to say. Martin Luther, when he was I won't go into a lot of story, but Martin Luther was encased in a castle for a short period of time after he had some difficulties with the Roman Church, and it was for his own protection. And so he was put there being protected. While he was there, this is like 1521 or so, he translated the entire Bible. But one of the things he had to say, okay. I must let the literal words go and try to learn how the German says which the Hebrew espouses. Whoever speaks German must not use the Hebrew style. Rather, he must see to it, once he understands the Hebrew author, that he concentrates on the sense of the text, which is essentially the same kind of thing I've been trying to say. It isn't the fact, and I showed Andy some Greek this a little while ago. He was impressed that he could read it. Actually, we had 2 English translations alongside of it. But it isn't that we have to read Greek or Hebrew. I don't read Hebrew. I can read the Greek. None of those are crucial to us. But when we're looking at a translation, we're hoping, we anticipate that the authors have made a real effort to get the sense of what the text was saying to the audience then and try to translate it into our times today. And the King James Version did a wonderful job in 1611. And ironically enough, it was rejected initially. I don't know if most of you know that, but the King James was put off and it was too new and et cetera, et cetera. But as it came down to it, it was a fantastic translation. It reached out and touched lives in a lot of ways. Most of our translations are excellent. They have a different perspective, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, on different levels. Some of them follow the King James part of it. Some of them are trying to get across a more functional aspect in the text, and there's some in between. When they were translating, they need to be accurate, clear, natural, and audience appropriate. All of those things are important, that they adhere to the original language and what the author meant then. They're clear to us, and they're natural, and they're audience appropriate. That is, we need to be able to read it, in English at the very least, in ways that make sense to us. These and thous just aren't the kind of language we utilize today, and therefore it makes it more difficult. Now, one of the statements I'm going to make right now is probably going to get some eruptions from some people. The reason the Bible is sometimes so hard to understand is because it wasn't written to you, but was written for you. And that's an important concept now. You weren't there in first century. It's not written to you, and therefore you need, in an effort to understand what they were receiving so that you can adhere your life to it, it was written for us, but not to us. Make sense? I'm sure that I'll get responses from that.
Well,
yeah, Andy?
I think that goes back to your point of when we're reading the scriptures, the context, the scenario around that event, the timing, what all is going on in the background is what that scripture's framed on, right?
Yeah, precisely. Oh, I didn't put that other part up there. I guess I ought to put that other part up there. It was written for you. I didn't know I'd done that. Cultural relativity has some effect. And I can't tell you how many times as I grew up, well, the Bible never outgrows itself. That's true. It doesn't. On the other hand, it is the translations that we're looking at might have outgrown themselves. That doesn't mean that there's any that there's concepts and that you can't understand what God is trying to tell us, or what the Bible was trying to tell you. You can still understand those things, but the translations need to be modified over a long period of time so that it follows in line with our languages that changes. How many times, again, have you these and thous and etc. that you get out of the King James? Nobody talks like that today. I'm not sure they did in 1611 at that point. But in any case, they don't do it today. Okay. Matthew 23, verse 5 there, they enlarged their tassels. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's a number of versions. I don't know if the New King James Version does it or not. You might look it up, Shirley. Matthew 23:5. it explains in those versions. The NIV does, I know that, and some of the others do, of their garments. So, because otherwise you have no idea what the tassels are all about. It's a quote from Exodus. Here's another good one that's up there. Now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city in Galilee called Nazareth. The 6th month. What is the 6th month? Is it June? You know, not in their schedules. It would have been something else. September to, I won't figure that out. Anyway, it was talking about the 6th month of pregnancy, but that's not explained very well in most of the versions. Or John, you did this parable regarding the tax collector, the tax collector and the Pharisee. He beats his chest. Is it King Kong? I mean, you have to look at that and say, what is he talking about? He is in sorrow, is what he was there. I'm in sorrow for the position that I placed myself in, and those of my family, and Lord, please forgive me for such things. And I don't have the pride. I don't want the pride. I'm beating my chest because I'm in so much pain and agony spiritually. That was the meaning behind that particular passage. But reading it, unless you make a study out of it, unless you dive into the scripture and that part of it, you don't understand what he's trying to tell us. How about this one? Acts 11:22. But the word was heard into the ears of the church, the one being in Jerusalem. Well, that's a weird way to put anything. But really what that means and what the text was trying to say is that they had received that, they understood it, and they were going about talking about it. We do the same thing. But ears meant something slightly different. And a report came to them in the attention of the church. The NET does a nice job of translating that. Here's a quote from J.B. Phillips. J.B. Phillips wrote a transliteration, if you will. I hate to use that word these days. Very similar to the Message. If you've heard of the text of the Message that was done a few years ago. But he said, and when he wrote the text, and if you want an easy thing to read, J.B. Phillips is still one of a good one to do it. He said, I felt rather like an electrician rewiring an ancient house without being able to turn off the main power. When you look and you look at the text, you have to be careful about how you go about translating it. And it should be appropriate to the intended audience. All right, here's a quick list of some of the translations. No, it isn't. Okay. And we have in our church building here the English Standard Version, but it's based a lot on the King James Version with an effort to try to alter the language wherever necessary. But it is also much more attuned to the original language than perhaps some of the other versions. And I'm going to put a slide up here in a second. You'll know what I'm talking about. Here's some more of what all these designations have. That list of things can be found. We have a paper that you can get online if you want, and you can check out the website, and we'll provide that. Now here's where I wanted to get to. Formal, that is that which is closer to the original language, but not necessarily as functional as it needs to be for you to be able to read it and understand it. So the line of the spectrum you get here is formal to functional. And I've tried to put some of these on here. They give you a feel for it. But in order to catch the metaphors and etc. that's being used in there in the text, if you do a formal translation, a very acute translation, you'll miss some of the metaphors, some of the allusions that is used, some of the examples. They just don't mean as much. They're translated correctly. They just don't mean the kind of thing. But if you go too far, you lose the culture in which it was written in. So that becomes what you adjust your translations to go about handling that. Let me see if there's any. All right. What do we mean about context? Well, by now you probably have heard enough from me on it, but I can't emphasize it enough anyway. Over and over again, the context in that, both literally, culturally, historically, and theological. Those are the key contexts. Literal, well, that makes sense to us. Well, at least you can understand, perhaps. It is, you take a section of the passage that you want to look at, and how does this thing fit? What did the author has to say? John 2. It's a story about Jesus' first sign. John uses a different word in his gospel than does the synoptic gospels. That is, Matthew, Mark, Luke. That word that they tend to use as the word for miracles, John uses the word in Greek for signs. He has a very specific reason for that. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, were written mid to late, well, let's call it from late 50s through probably the early 70s, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's writing his text undoubtedly in around 92, 93, 96 AD, absolute end of his life. Things had changed dramatically. And he was trying to get across the whole objective. Now again, it isn't that he's altering what had happened, but he's taken those significant items out of his life with Jesus and trying to get his current audience in AD 90s to understand not only Jesus, but being able to handle all the persecutions that was taking place with the church at that point in time. And there was a great deal. That's when he wrote Revelation. Actually, I think he wrote Revelation before he did the gospel, but that's a different story. So when we're looking at the literary part of this, and we go back to John 2, and what happened there in terms of John 2, is that Jesus goes to a wedding with his disciples. Now, just a few days before, he's picked up most of them, and he shows up at a local wedding in Canaan. Canaan's about 5-6 miles from Nazareth. So he's very well aware of being there. His brothers, and at least his mother is there. We know that because of what happens in it. So saving face in that culture means a great deal. And so when Jesus is there, they're running out of wine. Now you say, well, okay, I invited a few people on a Saturday wedding and they need to go home. But that doesn't occur in that culture at all. The wedding festivities would go on for at least a week. They're already out of wine. That was something you just didn't want to happen. So his mother comes to Jesus and says, do something about this. I mean, that's basically what she says. And he said, it's not my time. Now we see him make that comment in the 7th chapter of John. We see him make it in the 8th chapter of John. And not until the 12th chapter does he say, it's my hour. So what are we getting here? Well, Jesus, because his mother is asking for that to start with, to do something about it, he finally does. And he picks up, I guess like 150 gallons worth of water, and then he makes into wine. And not only that, it was an exceptional wine that they would. Usually when you had those kind of parties, the tradition was to put out the good wine first, and people would drink enough of it that they really didn't care, so you watered it down a little bit so it would last throughout the whole week. Well, that's when you read this passage, you'll see them, wow, this is really great wine. Well, yeah, but because Jesus had made it that way. And there's a lot of pieces to this thing that you can go diving into that 2nd chapter and get an understanding for. he took the barrels that were the water, which was the purification barrels that a very religious Jew would have used in terms of baptisms, that he would cleanse himself with. That's what those barrels are for. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had a lot of barrels sitting around in the desert. But Jesus takes those barrels, fills them with water, and has them, and he uses the purification. There's a great deal to that, but you need to understand what a wedding took place. It lasted 7 days. You need to understand that wine was a great deal used then, that it had to last a whole week. Otherwise, the people doing it would have lost a great deal of faith. And there, obviously, they must have been friends of at least Mary, if not Jesus, because he was invited to the wedding. What we need to pick up on, not only was Jesus invited to the wedding, but he brought along a whole bunch of people that may or may not have wedding invitations, so that the wine would have disappeared that much more quickly. Those are all things within that passage that if you take the time to look at it, you'll have a better understanding of what took place. It wasn't just that Jesus did the first sign, but it was a point in which they understood that this was special. And so we get the disciples saying, wow, I think I'm going to believe on this man. But John does something else to this, with this wedding. It is his first sign, so he's constructed his whole gospel around the 7 signs, if you will. The first half of the book of John, from, if you will, if you want to call it John 2, or through through the 11th chapter, a little bit into the 12th chapter. There are 7 signs. That is a completion. That means a great deal when you're reading it. But we would just pass over it in English. Well, okay, there were 7 signs. That's nice. No, 7 is a crucial number. It means a complete number. God created the whole world in 7 days, etc. And 7 goes on about it being a formal way of saying it is complete. Well, John is developing these signs, if you will. He's picked them out that were important to him as far as that goes, and showing that Jesus was going to complete his mission. And it starts in the 2nd chapter of John. Now, in terms of history, for us to understand, when Amos, if we were reading the book of Amos, he wrote around 750 BC. Micah was after the Babylonian captivity, if you will. And Daniel and some of the rest of them. Ezra and Nehemiah went through conflict in the 4th and from the 5th BC. That gives us a historical perspective. Ezra and Nehemiah had come out of not only the Babylonian captivity, but the Persian period of time. It was Cyrus that let go of the people in 539 BC, in which he said, go home. If you want to go home, go home. And he sent them out. All of that has an effect on these prophets as they write. Understanding that is a crucial aspect. And you say, well, how am I supposed to understand that? I'm just going to grab a Bible and start reading it. Yes, but if you have a text, a study Bible, you'll have a lot more effect on how you go about understanding the history behind these. And using, as we suggested last week, using a concordance to chase down the scriptures, if you will. At the same time, a Bible dictionary is of value because it explains what's going on around it. It wasn't necessary for them to go through a great deal of explanation because they lived during that period of time. So, understanding, thank you, John. Understanding the Babylonian and Persian captivity are essential to understanding the text that you're reading at. when Daniel is writing his text, he's in the Persian captivity. And part of Daniel, I promised you at some point to explain, but I'm not going to do it tonight, why some of it's in Aramaic. Most of our Old Testament is in Hebrew, almost all of it, with the exception of some passages in Daniel that begin in the 7th through, I want to say, part of the 9th chapter, if I believe. He switches from Hebrew to Aramaic and back to Hebrew. And you can look that up, and next time I'll try to tell you, I'll spend the time to tell you why. Or no, I shouldn't say that. My best guess as to why, because we're guessing. And there's a couple of smaller passages in the Old Testament Chronicles. I thought there was one in Ezra, but in any case, that's in Aramaic. Aramaic was the language in which they tended to use in the first century in Palestine, not the Hebrew. But in any case, when we're looking at the historical aspect of this, we need to understand what the prophets were doing, what they were facing, what was their message, why was it ignored. And it was, almost to a prophet, it was ignored. All of those things come into play when you're trying to study the text. And if you don't take that in it, you're just reading through verbiage. And it doesn't mean anything to you. You say, well, how am I supposed to know anything about what happened in Persia in 700 BC or something? That's why you go back to a study Bible. Is the best one I can tell you about. Commentaries, yes, they're of value, but not before you read the text. Read the text, read it again. As one of my professors said, read it 3 times, and maybe at that point you start to feel it. And if you need additional information, then reach out to some of these support things, like a study Bible or a commentary, but only after you read it and reading it in context. I mean, there's value in knowing that Amos prophesied before Isaiah did, for example. Even though he was an older time in the timeline, because Isaiah was 740-ish BC to probably 690, 680, something like that. But there's value in knowing that Amos was before it and what happened, and Assyria was more powerful, and it goes on and on. When we're reading it, that's important. Now, another historical, I don't know if you can see this or not. I've got temple at the bottom. So next slide. Jesus tells us about the temple, Matthew 12 something, and Mark and Luke, in which he makes this an unbelievable statement. I'm going to tear this, this thing's going to get torn down, I'm going to put it back together in 3 days, etc. Now, why was that unbelievable to these people? Well, first of all, you're looking at one of the most magnificent buildings in the first century. And Herod had gone to a lot of effort, the King Herod. He started rebuilding the temple in approximately 28 AD. And it went on through at least 37, maybe 40 AD before it was finished. So it wasn't even finished with the rebuilding part. You know, they had construction workers and whatever you do. When I was visiting Israel, I saw one of the stones that was at the bottom of the temple that was left. Most of it was destroyed by Titus in 70. But one of these stones weighed more than 40 to 80 tons of weight. My goodness, what kind of construction worker is going to handle 80 tons of rock? They moved those things in, and I won't go into that, but it was unbelievable, the whole temple area. And Jesus has waltzed them by this thing and said, the disciples say to him, if you read those passages, again, Matthew 12, Mark 13, and Luke, what? It doesn't ring bells to me right now, but at any rate, probably, well, leave it at Matthew 12 and Mark 13. They're walking by this and said, the disciples say to Jesus, isn't that really neat? Now, we'd look at that building and say, yeah, that's neat. I've been to Europe and I've seen the cathedrals. Those are really neat. But when you go back and understand the real meaning behind the temple, there wasn't a group of people historically that did not look at their temple and it meant something to their way of life. And the Jews even more so. The temple was everything. They circulated around it. They did their Passover with it. They did they worshipped with it. It meant everything to them. And Jesus says, I'm going to tear it down and put it back together in 3 days. That's an amazing statement. And it's amazing because the culture behind this thing was unbelievable of what they felt like the value is of the temple. It isn't just the fact that Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple in AD 70, which is 40 years later. It is the fact that he is trying to tell this group of people. And he has this discussion with somebody else. 4th chapter of John. The lady at the well. The time is coming when you don't need to worship any place except me. I mean, that's basically what he's saying. So that John already knew that the temple was destroyed, and he picks this discussion out that took place with the lady at the well in order to reemphasize the fact that Jesus is the temple. And so those are the kinds of things that when you're looking at the text, that you need to understand how valuable the temple was to those people. It wasn't just a building. A good example, the temple at Artemis, or if you will, the temple of Diana in Ephesus. It was an extraordinarily important building. It had been destroyed in, 300-ish BC by somebody that burned it down. And why did he burn it down? Because he wanted his name put up in lights, if you will. He wanted everybody to remember his name, that he was the one. Now, they executed him and put out a law that says, don't anybody ever mention his name, because that's why he had done it. And they rebuilt the temple. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Herodias wrote about it 450-ish BC and picked it out as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Temple worship was extraordinarily important to those societies. And we need to grasp that aspect when we're reading something as crucial. And the Jews had looked at their temple for years upon years upon years. The destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC was so dramatic to them that they didn't know how to worship God. And they took to doing Sabbath and etc. and doing all kinds of different things. But they developed their worship from that and then rebuilt the temple, and then Herod added to it. But we need to know that. And the only way you can go about knowing that, and to the audience here, is to understand not only the text that you're writing in, but the historical consequences that follow that text. Oh, I'm finally going to use a Greek word here, pericope, but I'm not going to use it. Theological context, if you will. Every passage does have a theological items in it. It telling us. It doesn't mean you have to believe in God. I do, and I'm adamant about that. But it does, to the people that you're writing to, they believed in God. And so when you're reading that, you need to think in terms of, all right, what is the literal aspects of this thing? What is the cultural aspects of this? What is the history behind this? What was the theological concept in which these people were looking at it and trying to relate to it? After that, you can understand the passage. Then you can make an application. Then and there, here and now. Not before. Otherwise, you get my cartoon that's up there, and I'm looking for a specific, passage that justifies my preconceived thought process. And please don't rush out and run and go to the internet. Just don't do that. I'm not saying there's wrong to have the internet, and I'm not that old. Well, Andy thinks I am, but that I don't have value in the internet. It's just that if you rely on the internet for that, for some piece of it, it is by one person's opinion, and you don't know what that person's opinion is of value. You're not even reading what else they might have written. So to rush out and go to the internet and pull up somebody's opinion regarding a particular passage doesn't help you study the Bible. One of my mentor, if you will, hopefully he's not watching this, but, well, maybe I do, Dr. Strauss, he pushed the idea that there's a big picture in every one of your passages, and you need to find that. What is it about this passage that tells you, one, what the meaning was to the audience, two, what the author was trying to convey, and how does that reflect on the rest of the text behind it, and then make the application once you understand what the big picture is. The big idea is what he always called it. And we can get help, if you will. Well, you can ask people too, but there's some wonderful, wonderful commentaries out these days that you can reach out there to do that. Keener has several of them. They're culturally, historically relevant to the text. One of the best Acts commentaries that you can read falls in one of those lines with Ben Worthington III. Excellent text. There are resources available to you in which you can study and have an understanding. And it isn't just the fact, well, if all I have to do is read this and then I'll understand it. That isn't going to happen. It just isn't. I don't care who you are, how much Greek that you might have, unless you have all these resources. I don't have them, and I've had all kinds of stuff, and I don't even come close to touching it. So whenever I look at a passage, and I try to do what I was taught, read it at least 3 times, understand the history behind it. Fortunately, I have a lot of that. And then go about looking at the culture and then seeing other thoughts on it. Only in that way do we begin to understand and study the Bible effectively. Only in that way does the Bible start to mean something to you. Only in that way do you see your life starting to change when you read the text. Otherwise, you're just reading it and going through it and say, I read it. That's nice. When you get to heaven, you can check it, God, I read my Bible. It is to change your mind. It is to change your life. It is to motivate you to alter what you've been doing so that you can turn around and be a more effective individual. Let me touch on a couple of these things. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. These are some of the, from Philippians, 4th chapter. I should have remembered that. It just dawned on me. If you want to go through this week and pick out a passage in which you can start to read it, and at that point trying to understand what is going on around it, try Philippians, the 4th chapter, verses 8 through 15, 16, 17, something like that. And pay a lot of attention to the 13th verse. I've got a couple versions up here of this. And see if you can pick out what the big idea is here. and see if you can, at that point, relate it to the rest of the text and make a real effort to try to see what Paul was trying to tell the Ephesians in terms of this particular text. Andy, can we go right into the next one?
You need the next
I know I don't have much time, but I wanted to start it.
one. Give me just a second.
Or is that going to be too hard?
No, it's not hard at all.
This is here and now, by the way. Oh, that's our building. Here we go. How to study the Bible. Hermeneutics. Wow, Howard, you finally gave us a word that we've got to try to understand. The simple definition of this is that I'm trying, hermeneutics is the understanding of old text, if you will, and seeing how to make it relevant to today's time period. That's really all hermeneutics is all about. It comes from a god of Hermes who was a great spokesman. Acts 14, I believe. Is it 14 or 12? No, 14. You see Barnabas and Paul running out and had done a miracle, and people were running around telling Barnabas that he was Zeus, if you will, and Paul is Hermes. That's kind of odd, considering that we see Paul having written 13 some odd books later, and you would think that almost the role would be reversed, if you will. But they're designating Paul as that individual, that godlike individual, that was the spokesman, that was able to, the communicator, if you will. That's where we get the word hermeneutics at. That which communicates to us what the meaning was in the scriptures for that period of time. That's all that it amounts to. Oh, there it is again. I thought you'd like me to repeat this. The reason the Bible is sometimes hard to understand is because it wasn't written to you. It was written for you. If you walk away tonight with nothing else than that message, one, context is everything. And two, the Bible is not written to you, it was written for you. That's an important principle when you're studying the text. What is it that I'm going to get out of that was written then and there for me here and now? And if you take that kind of perspective when you're studying the text and realize it isn't just pulling different quotes out of the Bible to try to say something, the Bible's not written that way. God didn't write to us that way. If you don't believe in God, the Bible still is not written that way. It is written to tell one long story about God, if you will. Whether you believe Him or not, that's what it was written for. And we need to find out every one of those passages how it interrelates with the other passages. Personally, I bring the baggage, and it is baggage, but I bring the baggage that says, I see a unity in the text. I really believe that. I think I can establish that. Love to have that discussion with anybody. But just because you might not believe that, the authors did. And so we're looking for, and should always look at, whatever passage we're looking at, what story is it telling me in relationship to all the other parts of the story. Parts, not new stories. All the rest of the whole story, how does it fit in that story? And when we're going to study, rather than grabbing the Bible and for me to try to argue a particular point of doctrine, let's grab the Bible, look at the passage, and see what it's trying to say to the audience then, by the author then, and the text then, to here and now. And what is hermeneutics? The science and art, if you will, of biblical interpretation. I've narrowed the definition down to religious texts, if you will, to the Bible. I'm being phased out that I'm almost done. What's the goals? And I'll end it here with this, because this is the concept, and I'll start it again. This is exegesis. That is the study of that. It is trying to draw out the meaning of the text. Another Greek word, and I'll tell it to you next week, I won't explain it this week, is pulling out meaning out of the text because that isn't there. And we tend to do that with the Bible. And that's why we can so many times people say, well, the Bible can mean anything to anyone, whatever time that they want it to mean. No, it doesn't. Whether you believe in God or not, it doesn't do that. So go back and study it, and you say, well, why all the differences and whatever? You can argue about the doctrinal aspects of this. That's an entirely different class. But in terms of the text, it had a great deal of meaning at a particular point in time that the author wanted a particular response with from his audience. And when we receive that, it can never mean more to us than what it did to them. That's not a hard concept, but it is one in which we have a hard time trying to understand and apply. And I guess I'm finished. So thank you very much for this evening. We'll continue on these lectures, and perhaps I'll get a little further along.